For more than 3 decades, one man has made the entire planet laugh without needing to say a single word. No catchphrase, no punchline, just a twitching eyebrow, a nervous glance at the camera, and a body that seemed to be held together by rubber bands. Mr. Bean became a global phenomenon precisely because he never had to speak. But almost nobody stopped to ask why the man behind him built his entire career around silence. Now at 70 years old, Rowan Atkinson has spent the last few years being unusually candid about the truth he spent decades hiding in plain sight, and it explains almost everything about the character the world thinks it knows. There is something almost paradoxical about Rowan Atkinson's fame. Mr. Bean is arguably the single most universally understood comedic character of the last half-century. Recognizable in villages and cities across languages Atkinson himself has never spoken a word of. Parents who have never watched a British sitcom in their lives know that face. Children who weren't born when the original series aired can still recite the beats of the Tea and Biscuit sketch or the driving test scene from memory, purely from clips passed around online. And yet the man who built that character has spent much of his life describing performing not as pure joy, but as something closer to a controlled, exhausting negotiation with a part of himself he never fully learned to master. Understanding why requires going back long, before Mr. Bean, before Blackadder, before any of it, to a childhood most fans of the character have never heard about. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born on January 6, 1955, in County Durham, in the north of England, the youngest of 4 boys in a farming family. One of his brothers died in infancy, and Rowan grew up alongside his 2 surviving brothers in a household that valued discipline and hard work far more than performance or attention-seeking. His father ran the family farm and later served as a company director. His mother came from a family with its own long roots in the region. Nothing about his early years pointed toward comedy. If anything, they pointed toward something quieter and far more solitary, a childhood built around routine, expectation, and the kind of practical seriousness that doesn't leave much room for showing off. Around the age of 5, Rowan developed a stammer. It wasn't an occasional stumble over a word here or there. It was a persistent, sometimes crippling speech difficulty that followed him through both of the strict Church of England boarding schools he attended. First a preparatory school, and later a secondary school known for pushing its students toward disciplined, formal futures. Teachers who remembered him from that era described a shy boy with an expressive, almost elastic face, who struggled badly to get his words out in class. His classmates were far less kind. He was mocked, imitated, and at times labeled an outsider simply because his speech didn't work the way everyone else's did. One of the boys who sat in classrooms near him during those years was a young Tony Blair, a couple of years his junior, who would later recall how rough school life could be for Atkinson at the time. For a child who already leaned toward shyness, that kind of daily teasing had a compounding effect. Rather than pushing him to try harder to fit in socially, it seems to have pushed him further inward, toward books, toward science, toward the kinds of subjects where precision and correctness mattered more than confident delivery. It's easy looking back to read this as simply the origin story of a class clown in the making. But by every account from people who actually knew him at the time, that wasn't what was happening at all. Rowan wasn't the boy doing impressions in the back row to get a laugh. He was the boy nobody expected anything performative from whatsoever. What makes the next part of the story remarkable is not that Rowan overcame his stammer through sheer willpower, in the way inspirational headlines love to suggest. It's stranger than that. He discovered, almost by accident, that when he stepped into a role, became someone else entirely, even a fictional, ridiculous version of himself. The stammer simply wasn't there. Atkinson has said in interviews over the years that his stutter comes and goes, and that when he plays a character other than himself, the stammering disappears. That single, strange discovery may be the real origin story of everything that came afterward. Comedy wasn't just a talent he happened to have. It was, in a very real sense, the only place he could speak freely. Despite the bullying and the speech struggles, Rowan was academically gifted, especially in science. He earned strong grades and went on to study electrical and electronic engineering at Newcastle University, graduating in 1975. By every outward measure, He was headed toward a technical career, not a stage. He continued his studies at the Queen's College, Oxford, working toward a master's degree and briefly beginning doctoral research, following in the footsteps of his own father, who had studied at the same college decades earlier. It was at Oxford that everything quietly shifted. Rowan got involved with the university's revue and drama scene, where he crossed paths with a young writer named Richard Curtis, who would go on to become one of Britain's most successful screenwriters. Curtis later described watching a painfully quiet, unassuming Atkinson sit through workshops and rehearsals, saying almost nothing at all, until the moment he actually got on stage, where he transformed into someone completely different. His physical comedy, his timing, his instinct for absurdity, none of it looked like it belonged to the same person who could barely get through small talk backstage a few minutes earlier. In August 1976, Atkinson performed with the Oxford Revue at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, his first real exposure on a national stage. It went well enough that a quiet engineering student suddenly had a foothold in a completely different world. He finished his master's degree and published his thesis in 1978, technically still an engineer on paper, and was later even made an honorary fellow of his old college in recognition of his career. But by then, the pull toward performing had become impossible to ignore. Engineering never fully left him, either. His fascination with mechanics and precision would resurface for the rest of his life, from his real driving license credentials used on set to his lifelong passion for cars. But the stage had become something engineering could never offer him, a place to exist without the fear of stumbling over his own words. What often gets left out of the highlight reel version of Atkinson's rise is just how long and demoralizing the early years actually were. Between the late 1970s and 1980, the BBC turned him down repeatedly. Auditions were brutal for someone whose stammer tended to resurface exactly when the pressure was highest, in interviews, in casting rooms, in the moments where he was expected to simply be himself and sell his talent verbally. There were points where he seriously considered walking away from performing altogether and returning to a life in engineering. His breakthrough came not from fixing the stammer, but from designing his entire creative approach around it. If speaking as himself was where the difficulty lived, then the answer was to stop being himself on stage. He built characters instead, strange, exaggerated, often nearly wordless figures who could carry a scene through expression and movement alone. A 1979 pilot called Canned Laughter gave audiences an early glimpse of a physical, largely silent character that would, years later, evolve into something the whole world would recognize. In 1980, the BBC finally gave him a real platform with Not the 9 O'Clock News. It did not launch well. The premiere was delayed by a general election hardly anyone watched, and critics were savage. One reviewer went as far as calling it one of the worst half hours of television ever broadcast. Almost any other performer's career might have ended there. But a BBC controller believed there was something worth protecting in the format and commissioned a second series anyway. That decision changed everything. Working alongside Pamela Stephenson, Mel Smith, and Griff Rhys-Jones, Atkinson helped build a show that would reshape British sketch comedy. It wasn't smooth behind the scenes. There were cast changes, budget pressures, and creative tensions. But it was also where Atkinson's obsessive attention to physical detail and comic precision really began to define his public image. One sketch in particular turned him into a household name almost overnight. Atkinson in a gorilla suit, delivering a furious, nonsensical rant about being overlooked for a major role. It was ridiculous, it was oddly specific, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. In an era before anything could go viral in the modern sense, that sketch still managed to spread by word of mouth, win awards, and cement Atkinson as one of the most exciting new comic voices in Britain. By 1982, though, the show ended not because of poor ratings, but because the entire cast was simply exhausted. The relentless writing schedule and performance pressure had worn everyone down, Atkinson included, whose underlying anxiety had never really gone anywhere. Rather than chase the momentum for more money or fame, the team walked away at the height of their popularity, each heading in a different direction. Atkinson's next major project was The Black Adder, which premiered in June 1983. Co-created with Richard Curtis, it imagined an alternate version of English history and starred Atkinson as the scheming Prince Edmund. The first series was expensive, shot on elaborate outdoor sets, plagued by terrible weather, and received a lukewarm critical response. It came dangerously close to being canceled outright. What saved it was an international Emmy win, which was just enough to convince the BBC to commission a second series, but only with a dramatically smaller budget and a simpler production format. That budget cut turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to the show. Blackadder 2, which arrived in 1986, brought in writer Ben Elton, sharpened the comedy considerably, and introduced characters like Miranda Richardson's unpredictable Queenie, who became an instant favorite. Atkinson's Edmund evolved from an awkward schemer into a razor-sharp cynic, and the show found the identity that would eventually make it one of the most beloved sitcoms in British television history. The final series, Blackadder Goes Forth, set in the trenches of the First World War, took an enormous creative risk by blending broad comedy with a genuinely devastating meditation on the human cost of war. Many involved worried the subject matter was too sensitive to joke about. Instead, the show struck an almost impossible balance, winning the BAFTA for Best Comedy Series in 1990, with Atkinson himself named Best Light Entertainment Performance. Its final scene, the characters walking slowly into no man's land, the image slowing and fading to a field of poppies, remains one of the most quietly devastating endings in the history of British comedy. Then, on January 1st, 1990, Mr. Bean arrived. Atkinson had been developing the character in some form since his university days, building a figure who spoke almost nothing at all and communicated entirely through physical comedy and facial expression. It didn't take long for the character to become one of the most recognizable comic figures on Earth, eventually broadcast in well over 200 countries. Here is the part of the story that Atkinson himself has only really opened up about in later interviews. Playing Mr. Bean was never simple joy for him. Because the character barely spoke, every ounce of comedic weight had to be carried physically, through his face, his posture, his timing, moment by moment, take after take. Atkinson has described the process as genuinely exhausting, both physically and emotionally, and has admitted that filming often left him drained in a way that other roles didn't. In a 2018 interview on The Graham Norton Show, he spoke candidly about how demanding the character was to perform and about the nagging, persistent feeling that he wasn't quite good enough, even as the character became a worldwide sensation. The success kept growing regardless. The 1997 feature film Bean became a massive box office hit, breaking UK opening records. But rather than lean further into live-action performances of the character, Atkinson found some relief in 2002 with the launch of Mr. Bean, the animated series, where he only needed to provide the character's occasional grunts and vocalizations rather than physically embody him for hours on set. It let the franchise keep growing with a new generation of younger fans without demanding the same physical toll from him. One of the character's most watched public moments came at the 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony, where Atkinson reprised Mr. Bean in a sketch watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It's often remembered as one of the standout moments of that entire ceremony, and also, by Atkinson's own account, an exhausting one that left him needing real recovery time afterward. Many longtime fans consider it the character's unofficial farewell to a global live stage, even though Atkinson has returned to shorter physical comedy projects since, including 2022's Man vs. Bee at the age of 67, a role that reportedly reminded him just how much slapstick performance now asked of an aging body. Away from the cameras, Atkinson's life has had its own share of very public turns. He met makeup artist Sinetra Sastry while working on Blackadder in the late 1980s, and the two married in 1990, going on to have 2 children, Lily and Benjamin. The marriage lasted for nearly a quarter of a century before the couple separated in 2014, with their divorce finalized the following year. Atkinson later began a relationship with actress Louise Ford, and the two welcomed a daughter named Ella in 2017, making Atkinson a father again in his 60s. He has also had moments of genuine real-world drama that had nothing to do with performing at all. In 2001, while flying with his family over Kenya, the private pilot on board reportedly lost consciousness mid-flight. Atkinson, who had no formal training as a pilot, took the controls and kept the aircraft steady until the pilot came around and the plane could land safely. It's a strange footnote for a man best known for pratfalls and chaos, a moment where the real person behind the character had to be genuinely, quietly heroic. Atkinson has never been shy about wading into public debate either. In 2012, he gave a widely discussed speech defending freedom of speech, arguing that too much language was being labeled offensive and that the law should protect uncomfortable ideas rather than suppress them. More recently, in 2023, he wrote a widely debated opinion piece questioning how environmentally friendly electric vehicles really are once manufacturing emissions are taken into account, a piece that drew significant criticism from scientists and journalists, particularly given Atkinson's well-known personal collection of high-performance cars, a passion that traces directly back to his original engineering background. Rowan Atkinson turned 70 on January 6, 2025. It's a strange milestone for a performer whose most famous character never seemed to age in the public imagination, frozen in a beige jacket and a battered Mini for eternity. The numbers around Mr. Bean today are staggering. Tens of millions of subscribers across the character's official channels, billions of cumulative views, and an audience that spans generations who never watched a single original 1990s episode live, but grew up on clips shared online anyway. Across his career, Atkinson has picked up major honors including BAFTAs, an International Emmy, and an Olivier Award, alongside a long list of nominations. He was appointed a CBE in 2013 for his services to drama and charity. And yet, in interview after interview, the picture that keeps emerging isn't one of a man basking in that legacy. It's one of someone who has spent decades quietly managing anxiety, who found his voice, quite literally, only by disappearing into other people, and who still, by his own admission, wrestles with whether any of it was ever really good enough. That may be the real story hiding underneath Mr. Bean's blank, wide-eyed stare all along. The character the world fell in love with because he never had to speak was created by a man who, for most of his life, genuinely struggled to. What looked like effortless physical genius on screen was, behind the scenes, hard-won and exhausting. Built on top of a stammer he never fully outran, only ever learned to work around. Audiences saw a beloved, slightly ridiculous man in a tweed jacket getting into absurd trouble. What Atkinson has spent the last few years finally admitting is that the person underneath that jacket spent most of his career simply trying to keep up with him.